Time? In the last speech of the evening, I'll be showing you why at the end of the day, there's no reason to keep this inefficient policy. There's no reason to stick with the flawed policies that have been instituted by Washington, when the evidence clearly shows, the statistics and the logic, as well as the analysis, shows that there's no reason to maintain this flawed policy. I'd like to start off by first analyzing the negative team's last speech and analyzing their different arguments. And I'll show you why at the end of the day, again, there's no reason to keep the estate tax. Starting off with voting issue point 1, she said that there's no solvency because of the empirical failure. I have one, and she said her first response was that it's the best empirics in today's debate round. My only response is that it's completely not analogous to the current plan proposed by the affirmative team, saying that, well, there were no advantages in 2010 because there was a tax break. Well, obviously, business owners are not just going to be like, hey, I might die in 2010, I'll hire all these workers, and then my children are going to have to pay the federal government. They're going to have to do this. Business owners aren't going to do that. It's not analogous to completely repealing the estate tax as a whole. Business owners knew that in 2011, the estate tax was going to come back at 55% at a $1 million exemption. They're not just going to completely disregard economics and real sound economic strategy just because it was not there in 2010. This is completely not analogous to the affirmative team's plan. Their second one was that of no advantages. I think I already described this. The second voting issue is that of no advantages. And they said that they're not their source indictment. The Center on Budget Policies and Priorities is a nonpartisan center. And they said also that the Brookings Institute is nonpartisan. First of all, we've never seen that the Brookings Institute is nonpartisan. Actually, I would submit that the Brookings Institute is very partisan. It's very to the left side on most issues. But in specific response to their first response, my first response is that the evidence has no impact. I believe the negative team has never responded to the fact that their evidence all it said was that parts of that study were flawed. Parts of that study were flawed. The study as a whole still stands, as me and my partner have instituted, have advocated throughout the entire debate round. And in fact, as my second response shows, there's no counter studies. There have been no other studies produced by the negative team saying the opposite effect. They've just said there's a few flaws in your study. Well, to refer to what the negative team said, this is the best thing we have. This is the best evidence we have to go off of. And the entire thing, of course, there are a few flaws. I'll agree with that. But the thing is that majority of it is perfectly fine. And the actual analysis on the economics is perfectly clear and perfectly correct. Moving on to their second response, that if it just mentions ways, they said it just mentions ways that farmers can avoid. My response is exactly. It mentions that, yeah, there are ways to avoid the estate tax, but you have to invest in it. You have to spend money on tax attorneys, specific estate planners, buying into living trusts and setting up living trusts. There are ways to avoid it, but you have to invest in it. And that's economically unsound policy. That's inefficient when we look to the economy. That money could be redirected to be invested in business. Which actually brings me back to a point I'm going to be stressing a lot throughout my speech. The negative team dropped justification 2 in the last speech. They did not mention the fact, what we produced in the 1AC, the fact that the economy would improve through savings and investment. They dropped that in the last speech. That means that they agree with this point. They no longer contest that point. That's the main crux of our case. The economy would be improved. They agree with this because they did not mention it in their last speech. Let's move down to the third response. That is, who's Jim Saxton? Well, I'm sorry this wasn't brought up earlier, but Jim Saxton was the chairman for the Joint Economic Committee, a congressional subcommittee that was specific to analyzing economic policy within Congress. He's perfectly well qualified. He's within Congress. He's a congressman. He was the chairman, actually, of the Joint Economic Committee. So he's perfectly qualified. This is other than the study. His specific study done by the Joint Economic Committee says the same thing that the other study says from the American Family Farm Bureau. So they're completely analogous. They're in complete compliance. We can only evaluate those where we see no counter studies from the negative team. Finally, the third reason for that of no reason for change. She mentioned disadvantage 1, that of lost revenue, and disadvantage 3, that of charities. In regards to lost revenue, first of all, justification 2. The economy improves, thus corporate income and individual income taxes increase, making up for the loss. My second response is that we replied with evidence. She didn't regard our evidence. She completely disregarded it and just said, who's Jim Saxton? Well, that's not a response. She didn't respond to the actual analysis. My second response is that the logic and the statistics are on the side of the affirmative team. This is again a point that I would stress to you judges. The statistics show that 170,000 households paid the estate tax in 2011. 67% of those households were middle and low-income families, not the rich. They were ones that were forced to liquidate off their farm assets, liquidate off their small business assets that are not only their livelihood, but are part of the investment in the economy, are part of the American dream. The estate tax crushes this. Ultimately, judges, we see three things. First of all, the estate tax does hurt. This is agreed by both teams. Secondly, the estate tax is going to get much worse in 2013. Again, agreed by both teams. The impacts of the harms drastically increase. Why do we need to keep this? The government is gaining basically nothing from this tax. We need to remove it from the system and abolish the estate tax. Thank you.